What is the moral argument for the existence of God? Is God a moral being? Today on the show, I interview Dr. J. Brian Huffling, professor of philosophy and theology at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and we had a lively discussion about the moral argument. And I agree with Dr. Huffling that the moral argument does succeed, but it is important to add some nuances in there that are worth noting, and we have a great discussion about that today. If you want to watch the bonus segment, be sure to stick around and follow the Patreon link in the description over to our Patreon page, where you can get access to the 5 more minutes with Dr. J. Brian Huffling, as well as all of our bonus segments with all of our interviewees. And you can also get access to our new segment, Thursday Lives, where I do a live podcast, and you can watch that through the the YouTube live link that I'll leave on the Patreon page for patrons only. And you can type in any of the questions that you might have and things like that, and we can have a live interaction that way. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, guys. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and I am excited to introduce my special guest to you this week. He is a professor of philosophy at Southern Evangelical Seminary. His name is Dr. J. Brian Huffling. Dr. Huffling, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I'm sure you got a busy schedule as a professor and everything, so I greatly appreciate it. This is a topic that I have been looking forward to discussing. I've been trying to get somebody somebody who's kind of has an expertise in this area to come on and discuss the moral argument and kind of approaching it from a Thomistic philosophical route in that way. But before we get to the topic of today's discussion, if you don't mind introducing yourself to those who may or may not be familiar with you, kind of who you are and what you do.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Brian Huffling. I have been a student and now I'm professor at SES for a while. I started in 2004 because I had my own personal questions as to how I knew Christianity was true. I wanted to figure out for myself, how do I know that God exists? How do I know the Bible is reliable? I didn't doubt it. I just wanted to know how I could be certain and how I could better communicate and that kind of thing. I live currently in Statesboro, Georgia. I've got 2 kids, married for about 15 years, a couple of cats. Teach philosophy and other things, mainly philosophy at the school. I'm the director of the PhD program. Mm-hmm. As far as hobbies go, I like playing guitar and have not done this in a while, but played golf and backyard astronomy. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, I play guitar and golf myself. But,
sweet. Okay.
Yeah. I don't have a telescope, and I was never really into that, unfortunately. But anyway, again, thanks for coming on. You recently had a debate with Michael Shermer, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about that. How did the debate go?
I thought it went well in some ways, and it was frustrating in other ways. The school really just wanted to get our views out there. We had about a day conference on the problem of evil, and the culmination was our debate. And so it was basically on is evil good evidence against the Christian God? Mm-hmm. And if your listeners don't know, Michael Shermer his background is in psychology and more of the natural sciences. He's written several books. He's very well published. Super nice guy. I had a good time having him at school and interacting with him. We have a little bit of a back and forth in his magazine called Skeptic Magazine, coming out in a couple months. It's a pretty successful magazine. So the good parts of the debate where we were able to get out there and just have the debate, get our views out there. It was frustrating because the issues of God and evil really are philosophical in nature, but I really couldn't get him to come into the philosophical arena. He wanted to stay in the natural sciences, and natural science studies nature. God is not part of nature, natural sciences really can't study God per se. It's not a knock against science. It's just not what science does. Like philosophy can't do what natural biology and physics do. But he even admitted that if God does exist, science wouldn't tell us. He wanted to keep coming back to science and that, this is really a philosophical issue. So it was good, and it was somewhat frustrating. But we are getting this and print dialogue going as well in a couple months, which would be cool too. So overall, I think it was successful.
Yeah, I watched the debate, and I pretty much agree with your assessment.
Yeah.
As far as the substance goes, I could see how it would be somewhat frustrating, as
Yeah.
like you said. But I've never met Michael Shermer, but he does seem like a nice guy, and I appreciate his stance on free speech and different things like that. He's
Yeah.
outspoken about those matters as well. But today we're going to be talking about the moral argument for the existence of God, and kind of your take on that. You wrote an article recently about that, or somewhat recently about that, and that's where I came across that article and said, yes, finally, I can get this guy to come on and talk about this issue. It sounds like he's what I'm looking for. So, but before we do that, or before we get into your view on the argument, I thought it might be beneficial to go ahead and lay the argument out, as well as define some terms as they're traditionally or usually understood. So how is the moral argument usually stated?
Well, there's a couple different ways. One that we get normally from, say, Bill Craig would be something like, if God does not exist, then objective morals and duties don't exist. Objective morals and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Mm-hmm. That'd be kind of the conditional form. And then more from like Norm Geiser, we get arguments like all laws, and C.S. Lewis, all laws have a lawgiver. There is a moral law, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. Mm-hmm. All right, and as put, those have a lot of weight to them, just a lot of strength, depending on how they're used.
Yeah, that seems about right. So what exactly do you see a problem with the argument as it's stated?
Well, it depends on what is meant by some of these terms. So oftentimes the moral argument wants to tether our morality to quote unquote God's morality, mm-hmm. and that I see is problematic. But just as arguments are stated, I don't see a huge problem with them, mm-hmm. because I do agree there is an objective moral law that's written on our hearts as human beings, and that there has to be an objective source for our existence as human beings. But the way I use that argument, if I ever use it, is more of a metaphysical argument, not so much an existential moral argument, which it can be used that way. But I think the stronger claim there with the argument is, yeah, there has to be a God to produce the human race to have an objective essence, and the essence itself shares this objective human moral code, mm-hmm. right? And then Bill Craig would have a different view because he's more of a divine command theorist. He wouldn't even affirm a divine human essence per se. He would say whatever God says, you do it, and that's where the objectivity comes from. So it just depends on really how one's coming from, what point of view we're coming from. I think they can be used effectively. I just think that oftentimes they kind of resort to a very anthropomorphizing of God being moral, which I would reject him being moral like us.
Okay. So, I mean, we see in the scriptures God is good, God is love, God is these different things. So how is it that you can say that God is, or that you have a problem with saying that God is moral, or he is a moral being?
Okay, so we would definitely think that scripture is absolutely right and correct, holy inerrancy, all that. So God is good, he is just, he's merciful, he's all those things. 2 points. One would be that those things would be couched probably more in metaphysical categories and terms, not moral. Mm-hmm. So when we think of a human being loving somebody, like I love my wife or my kids or whoever, a lot of that has to do with a very emotional kind of feeling to it, and there's nothing wrong with that. And also a notion of willing their good. Mm-hmm. And so we would think that the traditional view of God loving means that God is willing our good. And so having created us, he didn't have to create us, but supposing he did, then he also wills certain things to be there for us, to be good for us. And so we would call that God's justice. So God making us what we are would also create the things that we have to have in order for us to be able to flourish. So that would be love and justice. Mm-hmm. So we wouldn't say they're moral because and what I mean by God's not moral is that he just, unlike us, he has no obligations or any kind of standards that are superseding him or imposing on him. And also, the second point is we have to understand language when we apply it to God and things in the world have to be seen as analogical. In other words, when I use the word good for you and me or my cat or my cheeseburger or whatever, The word good there doesn't mean exactly the same thing as when applied either to each other or even to God.
Okay. So whenever you say that God does not have this moral standard that of which he has to abide by, or however you want to word that,
Right.
how does this avoid the how does this avoid God being arbitrary? As in, if he has no moral standard, then kind of whatever he does, wouldn't that just kind of turn out to be good?
Yeah. Okay. So what you're referring to is historically known as the Euthyphro Dilemma. Um, and this came out. I didn't even say what the debate was about with Michael Shermer. So it was debate. Yeah, well, I did. I just did the topic. The issue comes out of these kind of discussions on ethics and God about, well, if God just has no standard that he has to conform to, whatever he does is arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he is. I would say he's completely free, and if you want to call that arbitrary, then I have no problem saying that. But we make a distinction in Thomistic philosophy between absolute necessity and suppositional necessity. So, for example, God did not have to create the universe. But supposing he did, he can't go back and undo it, right? So supposing he created humans, then we now necessarily are. Not out of some kind of strict absolute necessity, but just supposing God did will X, then X just is the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
So God has willed humans, in the Thomistic Aristotelian view anyway, to have an objective essence or human nature. And certain things are good for that nature and certain things are bad. So God creates us with a final end. Ultimately, he's our final end or goal, our what we're striving toward. And so there are objective things that get us along our further end, whether it's just preserving in life, enjoying life itself, being happy, or seeking after God as our highest good. So God having made a fixed, universal, objective essence that we all share, he also has willed certain things to be good and bad for it. So he can't just, at this point, having willed humans, will that murder or rape are good, because that destroys human nature, right? So assuming and supposing that he has willed to create what he has to created, he has made an objective standard, as if you want to call it that, but he's not using a standard outside himself. He willed to make human nature and essence itself an objective essence that we all share. And in doing that, also made certain things to be good for us. And if we don't have those things, that would be evil. Mm-hmm. And so what is good for a human isn't arbitrary because of the way he's made our nature. Is that making sense?
It makes sense to me because I'm familiar with the terms and stuff. Hopefully we're not losing the audience. They may or may not be familiar with the Thomistic philosophy. So let me kind of say it in perhaps a different way, and let's see, and also put it in the form of another question. So it seems that on the divine command theory view, morality is grounded, because in this conversation and whenever I listen to skeptics and Christian apologists talk about the moral argument, you often hear this grounding of morality. It seems that on the divine command theory, that morality is grounded or finds its source in the commands of God. And then it sounds like what you're saying, that on the Thomistic or Aristotelian view of morality, that morality is grounded or finds its source in human nature.
Right. Now, of course, God will be the cause of that, so I'm not cutting him off in that link. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that whatever makes an action morally good or not is whether or not it promotes the flourishing of human beings, both just in our normal day-to-day life, food, water, shelter, and then ultimately in our spiritual course of life too, with God being our ultimate end. And so God, having created us the way he did, this nature that we all share. I mean, we all need food, water, shelter, all that kind of stuff. And so whatever promotes those goods would be good. And there's a moral sense, and there's other instances of being good and evil too. So there are objective needs, and if those are being met, then we can call that objectively good.
And it sounds like, I mean, you mentioned, food, water, these sort of things, that what is necessary for human flourishing can be discovered through observation. And so it actually kind of seems like does our friend Michael Shermer not have a point in using natural sciences to allude to morality?
Yeah, and he does, and we agree on this point somewhat because we both. I know the flourishing of sentient creatures sounds very atheistic in a sense, but there's some overlap there because it is just the case that we, on some level, to have a good life means that you're flourishing and you're happy and your needs are being met. And he wants to promote. He wants to say that being moral is simply providing for those needs. And that's only one level of what I'm referring to as morality. And he would admit, and he defines evil as the intentional harm of a sentient creature. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I just think there's a broader, deeper understanding of that as well. So we both think that science can provide shelter, food, medicine, that kind of thing. But we're going to differ in terms of, well, where did this human nature come from? He's going to say it came from evolution. I'm going to say that we are created by God supernaturally. Mm-hmm. And so there are some things that Michael and I, that other atheists and I might not agree on, that Michael and I happen to agree on. We're just going to disagree as to what that entails or how it got there or some of the nuance of it.
It sounds like, and of course you can correct me, but just listening, it sounds like an atheist is not tethered to a subjective or relative morality, that they can actually have objective morality if they're willing to subscribe to this sort of Aristotelian view of morality. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that anybody, regardless of their beliefs of God, can be a quote unquote in the everyday sense of the term, not in the theological sense, but be a good person. Helping your neighbor, being there for people, doing the right thing. Usually speaking, you can have a decently good life from just a normal everyday, again, not theological point of view. You don't have to know that God exists, but our point, and it's kind of similar to our presuppositional debates with them. Yeah, God has to exist with the ontological source. We just don't have to know about him in order to carry out this moral code, because he's given it to us to be able to reason from and know intuitively.
Yeah. You were breaking up there, sorry. But yeah, that makes sense from sort of like an epistemological standpoint, that you can know objective morality without believing in God. But can they actually have an objective morality, as in an ontological sense, if they're grounding morality in human nature just as we are? They're just not going one step further, which it seems that you would say human nature itself stands in need of a cause like God to even exist. And then, like you said, Michael Shermer would deviate and go towards an evolutionary cause for that, but he would still actually have an ontological objective morality. Is that correct?
I think so. So what I'm saying is, someone like Michael and I would say that there is what it means to be human. We're probably going to agree with that, at least to an extent, on just a normal natural science kind of definition, maybe not a philosophical definition. And then on the normal everyday run-of-the-mill, what it means to be good or moral. Michael knows what that is, and I think everyone just using common sense and their internal conscience. People who aren't psychotic or those kind of things, or some kind of mental problem, have a basic understanding of what good and bad are, even if they don't practice it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
sure. As C.S. Lewis says, we all know what good is, and we also know we're not doing it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to move from kind of the existence of objective morality to our moral duty or moral oughtness. But first, I want to give a patron shout out and say thank you to Hank. Thanks so much for your support. Hank's actually a good friend of mine. But thank you to all of our patrons. And if you're listening, I know what you're thinking. You've always wanted me to shout your name out on the podcast. It's just what you've always dreamed of. But today can be the day for you. You can head on over to our Patreon page by following the link in the description and become a supporter of Help Me Believe. Again, thanks so much. And when you become a supporter, you can watch the bonus segment. Today's bonus segment will be with Dr. Huffling, my guest, who is the professor of philosophy at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and we've been discussing the moral argument for the existence of God and kind of a bit of a critique from a Thomistic philosophical standpoint on this argument. And so we're going to move into this moral duty and kind of why we should be moral. Dr. Huffling, it's one thing to argue that moral duties exist. It seems like another thing to argue that we ought be moral. Is that correct? Or I'm trying to think of how to word this. Are you tracking with me though?
Say it again so I can be a little more clear. I'm not sure if I caught your distinction there.
Okay, so the difference between the existence of objective morality and then kind of is there a way, and then kind of a motivation for acting moral? Is there any objective answer to? So I can say, yeah. I mean, you can take it from either camp that we've been discussing here, from divine command theorists who say objective morality is grounded in the commands of God, but the question would still remain, why should I listen to God? And then on the Thomistic standpoint, that objective morality is grounded in human nature or something like that, and human flourishing. But the question would still remain, why should I care about human flourishing?
Okay, so there's two different levels here. One is just the everyday normal human level. And why should I care? Well, I think people just have an innate sense of what it means to be good and then bad, and they have this intuitive notion of, well, I know that if I see somebody needs help, I should help them. If I don't, then there's something wrong with that. Mm-hmm. So why should I care about that? Well, I think people who want to, unless there's something just wrong with the person mentally, most people just have some understanding of what I'm doing here is wrong. So why should I care? Well, we should care to promote other people flourishing, society's flourishing, and also understand that I want people to treat me the way that I want to treat people the way that I get treated as well. Or I want people to treat me the way I treat other people. Mm-hmm. And then there's the real punishments. There's punishments and rewards here with like law enforcement. You might go to jail for not doing what you should do in some cases, or anything that would be illegal. Mm-hmm. So there's real punishments here, and then there's spiritual punishments. Of course, we would call that heaven and hell. And even within heaven and hell, there's also punishments and rewards as well. So at some point, we can just show people why they should be good. If somebody really doesn't know why they should be good, I would have a hard time even believing somebody who said that they didn't know why they should be good. Yeah. But I can give very practical answers like, well, you should be good because you want people to be good to you, or you don't want to go to jail or get a ticket, and you want to live with God and not in eternal hell forever. Mm-hmm. So we can discuss that. But you can't motivate people after some point. You can reason with people who are reasonable, but if they're not reasonable, you can't. So there's only a certain point at which you can take that to.
This is, I'm just contrarian by nature. Obviously, I agree with everything you just said. I obviously believe that we ought to be good to one another for all the reasons you just gave. But this contrarian nature that I just have and am predisposed to is like, okay, but what if somebody said this to you, Haden? What if they said, well, why should I care about that? And I'll be like, well, how could you not care about that? Well, that's not really a satisfactory answer. It kind of seems like at some point it just breaks down almost.
Yeah.
Unless there was a way to say, you can't avoid trying to be good. You're just going to. And that's the route I keep trying to go. I'm just trying to think this through. Do you have those problems as well, or am I just the only weird person?
No, some people want to push it that way, and some people are just doing it just to be contrarian. Or contrary, but I think that we can just give practical reasons up to an extent. You don't want people to think you're a jerk all the time. You want friends. you don't want to get a ticket or go to jail or whatever, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of God's grace eternally. Yeah. And if those don't motivate somebody, I don't know what would.
Yeah.
And that's as far as you can go.
Yeah, that makes sense. But so we've been discussing the moral argument for the existence of God as it's traditionally stated by folks like William Lane Craig. And so you're not really saying that this argument, or perhaps you are, but you're not really saying that the argument doesn't succeed. Is that correct?
I'm not saying it doesn't succeed. I'm just saying that the way it's used sometimes can presuppose certain things that I personally would not hold to, and that it could just lead to an area that I think would just be wrong theologically. So, for example, if the moral argument has to presuppose that God is moral and He's our moral standard, which is how a lot of these arguments go. Or if they don't say it, it presupposes it basically.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they say that we're good because we somehow reflect God or we're kind of tethered to God's goodness, that's where I think we have a problem. And I would say the arguments, as far as they go, are good as long as they're made in a more metaphysical sense of God being the cause of our human nature, and our human nature being what is really the grounding of goodness. Not that it comes from us, but that God causes it in us within our nature, as Romans 2 says, kind of written on the heart as our conscience. So they're not, the arguments themselves aren't necessarily bad, but they oftentimes presuppose what I think are wrong pictures of God, over anthropomorphic pictures of God, like God being too much like us. Or they go down that direction. Either presuppose or kind of go in that direction. But as far as I just laid them out to you a little earlier, I don't think that they're wrong in that regard. I just think that they are oftentimes used in the wrong way, perhaps.
Yeah. So earlier we were discussing the Euthyphro Dilemma and kind of, if is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? And we want to avoid kind of reaching either of those two conclusions. And one way that people have done this is to say, to back up and say, no, God just is the standard of morality. And so you see something wrong with this as well, correct?
Yeah, because I don't think that we have any reason to think that God is moral in the sense that we are. So we're moral because we measure up to some standard. So I'm good if I do things that kind of, in a sense, to use a philosophical term, accidentally make me good, or make me good dependent on me doing those things. And I don't think we can say God is good dependent on what He does. And I don't think that we can say that it makes a lot of sense to say that a non-human, unlimited, infinite, spaceless, timeless, changeless being is the one-to-one standard of everything opposite of that, like finite, material, temporal, changeable things. But I do think He's the cause of our goodness, and it is true to say that our morality is based in God as our cause, the cause of that human essence. So I'm not saying God isn't the cause of our morality. I'm just saying that God isn't moral Himself. So like He caused us to be material, but He's not material. He caused us to have characteristics X, Y, and Z, but He doesn't have those characteristics. So I just don't think that it makes sense to say that God is moral, at least in the sense that we are.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Just like, as you said, the way that God created us to be physical and material, it doesn't follow that God is physical and material. And in the same way, concerning morality, I think that's a clarifying way to put it. I got one last question for you. Before we go to the bonus segment, again, if you want to watch the bonus segment, 5 more minutes with Dr. Huffling, be sure to follow the link in the description to our Patreon page and become a supporter. But that question is, if you were going to give an argument for the existence of God, starting with moral premises or premises having to do with morality, how would you state that argument?
I wouldn't necessarily. Well, yeah, I would probably. I'd probably try to give the argument that there is an objective law. I wouldn't necessarily word the argument differently than I gave from Geyser's point of view. Like all laws have a lawgiver. There is a moral law, therefore there's a lawgiver. But I would focus on the fact that we have an objective essence or nature as human beings that make us what we are. And part of being a human being is just this moral makeup, right? This moral code or conscience. And so I would just say that God is our cause of our nature, and He made our nature to be this way. Now, if I put it into different premises, I don't know. I haven't put it in different premises. I probably should do that, but I wouldn't necessarily.
No, it's okay.
I wouldn't necessarily differ from the Geislerian or Lewisian, if I can think of a term, phraseology of that argument, or even Bill Craig's argument. I just would tether more in human nature and not in God's nature as Him being moral, in a sense. Am I getting at your question at all?
Yeah, I think you in the article you said you would you could start from the existence of an objective moral law, and then show that to be tied into human nature. But then you would more or less have to give a cosmological argument.
Yeah, I do think that to make the moral argument work, at least it's stronger to base it on human nature, and then our cause in God, we're the effect of God's causality. So that would be more of a cosmological kind of thing. So if someone has a very metaphysical kind of underpinning to it.
Mm-hmm. Does Aquinas make this argument?
I'm not aware of anywhere where he makes the moral argument for God. He gives the famous 5 ways, and then in other places there's actually some disputed ways that he might give, whether or not he's actually giving an argument for God or not. Like everything is composed of existence in an essence, but that can't go back forever. So there's got to be an existence that its essence just is to exist. So those kind of arguments. I'm not familiar with Aquinas giving any kind of a moral argument per se.
Well, we'll have you back on sometime to talk about the 5 ways, or one of the 5 ways. We'll pick one out. That seems like it would be a lot of fun to do. Those are my favorite arguments for the existence of God.
Me too.
And I think they still succeed. I'm not convinced of people who have tried to show them to be false. But anyway, Dr. Huffling, greatly appreciate you coming on to discuss this subject. I think it's important. I think it's something worth noting. The moral argument is a popular one given, and there's kind of some misunderstandings around it, so I appreciate you. Hopefully, Dr. Huffling provided you with some clarity on the issue. I know we got pretty philosophical pretty quick, but I think you'll find it clarifying and enlightening. So, again, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to come on. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks, Haden.
Thanks so much for joining us, guys. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review on the podcast if you're listening. And, of course, if you want to watch the 5 more minute bonus segment with Dr. J. Brian Huffling, be sure to follow the Patreon link in the description and become a supporter of our ministry. And you get all sorts of exclusive stuff over there on our Patreon page. So thanks so much for joining us, guys, and we'll see you next time.